and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Metric Stream's Global Summit. Specifically, today we are gathered with a great panel to talk about navigating cybersecurity in supply chain. That's a topic very near and dear to me. My name is Vidya Falke. I'm the head of innovation and cloud at MetricStream. With me, I have four people who have fantastic track record on this topic. I won't go too much into the details of their background, but as we get into the first set of questions and discussions, they can perhaps highlight some of their areas. I will start off with Julian Hay. He is the global head of non-financial risk at Fidelity International, has over 20 years of experience in fintech, has worked in Deutsche, DWS, and brings a vast experience on this topic of, again, as I said, cybersecurity risk in supply chain. Next is Alex Goldman. He is also global head of risk assessments at IHS Markets, and he has been in the business for 2 decades. In past, I worked at BNY Mellon doing a lot of IT transformations, especially involving supply chain and IT on that area. The third panelist is Orlando Fernandez Ruiz. He's a senior tech specialist at the Bank of England and has been driving a lot of topics around the senior managers certification regime and has dealt with standards and policies in that arena. And finally, I have Kevin Flood, who is the head of supply chain security at M&G PLC. He has been doing this work not only for supply chain but broader security as well, over 7 years at M&G itself. So that's the stellar panel I have. I mean, who better than these four gentlemen to talk about this? And especially in this day and age of COVID-19 situation we are in, there's a major disruption in the business, a lot of digitization focus, and so on and so forth. And so that's a perfect background to start talking about where this world is headed and get their perspective. So welcome, gentlemen, for this panel. And I'll start off with perhaps in no particular order. Maybe Alex, we can start off with you. The first topic is, as an organization, you're not dealing with, small set of vendors in the supply chain. Right now, the numbers are that of scale. So I'm sure there are situations where you have seen that the IT vendors in your cyber ecosystem have a different perception of risk because they are at their own customer base or the entities that they supply to, right? So for every situation, the risk perception may be different. So what has been your experience in trying to figure out how to not only negotiate that situation, but also ensure that, once you're past that point, how do you sustain it and take it forward? So, Alex, perhaps your experience, and then we can turn to the next set of panelists on that question.
Great. And thank you for having me. Great to be here and also share this panel with other industry experts. I think on that particular question, it really happens all the time. I think the risk posture is complicated, it's multidimensional, and often many vendors are subject to either directly part of multiple regulations or their customers are subject to multiple global regulations, whether it's directly for TPRM or data privacy. There needs to be consistency in the vendor due diligence approach. So first of all, it's really important that everyone transitions from standard checklists to really understanding the objectives of what they're trying to accomplish when understanding risks of their vendors. And then on the vendor side, it's really important that vendors proactively think through how they're perceived, not just internally, but looking outside in by their customers. And then I always see this. It happens every day, where whenever you complete a risk assessment and a given vendor, you will see differences of opinion. You will see that perhaps a bank is demanding a higher level of scrutiny than the vendor is willing to either put in place or provide transparency for. I think the single most powerful way of bridging the gap in that negotiation is always tied together with your sourcing cycle, and see whenever you are really negotiating any type of new deals, renewals, have new business opportunities, applying that commercial pressure to your supplier to give you that better transparency, to agree on a more robust and thorough remediation plan that the vendor can be held accountable to. There are many other techniques, but that one is really a silver bullet that works at least most of the time.
Yeah, glad to know there is a silver bullet. Julian, your views, please. Go ahead, Julian.
Um, yes, thank you very much. So I think what we're observing probably kind of three thematics in that space in terms of the type of vendors that could fall in that category. One is really when you have to deal with organizations that are less mature than we are, and that could include startups, for example, or much smaller firms that either have not reached the same level of maturity we have, or they do not have the same level of resources that we actually have as an organization. Which leads me to a second category as well of vendor that could fall in that category is non-regulated firm. And I've seen that time and again where the level of requirement we will have as a regulated firm might be higher than our suppliers, and that can lead to issues. And without naming any names, I've seen that with very big organizations, especially a very famous cloud provider that was falling behind, for example, GDPR implementation, and created some problem for a number of financial firms. I think the last thing we're observing is also you have actually different culture and cultural approach to the topic, and perception of risk can very differ across a footprint on the same topic. And to give you a concrete example, uh, over all the years I've been working in finance, I've always observed that Europe and Europeans are probably a bit more risk conservative and averse and risk averse than can be Asian, in the Asian culture, for example. And we're really seeing that in the perception of risk and the way they approach a negotiation.
That's excellent. Alex, given you know your experience, I mean, I think just to those points, right? Would you have anything else to add, or should we?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's definitely a difference in maturity between different suppliers, and different suppliers also play a different place in the overall supply chain. So you really cannot hold startups to the same level of accountability as your mission critical suppliers, and you do have to kind of give them a little bit of a break, but then within a certain framework. So very insightful points, Julian. I definitely agree. Thank you for that.
Good. So Kevin, I think if from your perspective, right, you have seen, yes, there is different levels of maturity. You know,
Yep.
so I get the point about during renewals, contract negotiation. At times, you can create some level of comfort or level of change if it's needed in the way the relationship is going to go on. But how do you see
Yep.
it being sustained, right? I mean, there is sometimes it's a contract which is 3 years worth. So is it a matter of
Yep.
just educating the business on how it is being used and then let them figure it out, or it's a constant education process?
I think it's very important to be transparent with your supply chain. as well. I think if you're honest with them, they're honest with you. And taking the points from Julian and Alex, there's the commercial silver bullet you can use, which means you can put things into schedules, etc., to be completed over a certain amount of period during the contract, which means that they've got some room to grow and mature as time goes on. But also, you end up doing a certain amount of free consultancy, if you like, with some of the less mature organizations. And I think it depends then on how often you do your oversights. Do you do a continuous monitoring approach? Do you do half yearly, quarterly, yearly, or something like that? I mean, I've got a concrete example, similar really to Julian's one. We had a rather large supplier who was doing some quite heavy work for us, PII heavy work for us. And as things go on these days, they're engaging a fourth party to do the actual work. And when we looked into the fourth party, they were well below what we would expect in terms of due diligence, security, privacy, etc. And by the fact we've got the contract negotiated properly, we've forced them into using a more recognised supplier. And I think it's making sure that you're looking at your supply chain further down the line as well, not just with your direct supplier, but also down into your fourth, fifth, and maybe sixth parties, particularly in the days of outsourcing. So not only is it yourself that's transparent with your supplier, but you also need to be transparent and educate the business in terms of what they're buying and what they're actually looking at. It's just getting a level of understanding across the board. And I find it's a much better relationship and a much more secure way of doing business if everyone is a little bit more honest with each other. I think that answers your question.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, that great answers. I think, yeah, some takeaways for our audience as well. So I think we did hit upon, again, data privacy. Last year, a lot of 2019 was a lot about GDPR, and then locally out here CCPA. So IT partners are now getting deeply ingrained in the business process, right? Not just outsourcing technology, but now they are providing services around data, right? The topics around data privacy and confidentiality on those controls are bringing a whole set of new heterogeneous actors, if you will, right? So, I mean, perhaps we start off with you, Orlando. You know, since these are regulatory changes that are happening, how do you start figuring out, how to embed this, right? It's not a question of just checking a box, but now you need resilience around these topics throughout your supply chain. And as the last point was made, right, it's not just second or third parties, the fourth, fifth, sixth goes down the entire supply chain. So, what are your thoughts? What are the best practices or some of the thinking that has evolved in the last few years?
So I think the first thing to understand is that there are a lot of different regulatory disciplines that are increasingly intersecting in this area. So the field of sort of financial regulation, whether it's prudential or conduct, intersects very closely with kind of data protection, which is kind of evolved very considerably, particularly in recent times in the European context. So actually trying to sort of understand the interactions, intersections, and synergies between different regulatory obligations, especially on a cross-border basis, is a very good sort of important first step. The management of supply chain risks is also a very kind of rich topic and a very complex one as well, because the further removed a fourth, fifth, sixth party and beyond are from the original contracting supplier, the harder it becomes for them to kind of understand and adhere to the obligations that the financial regulation institution as a client might have as well. And this is something that we are exploring a lot with industry, how one can manage supply chain risks. I think in the European and also, sorry, in the UK and also in the global context, one of the things that has been at the forefront of regulatory thinking for quite some time is the notion of operational resilience. And in a way that helps simplify these discussions a little bit, in the sense that the underlying idea is for institutions to identify their most important business services and then ascribe sort of impact tolerances for those business services that can be tested and maintained through severe and plausible disruption. So if you start off with what it is that is important for your organization in terms of the delivery of key financial services and where your third-party dependencies are, it's sort of a good platform for analysis, and it helps sometimes simplify and cut through complexity.
Anyone else has thoughts on that topic?
No, I think that.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Good.
Sorry, Julian. No, I think some very good points from everybody, and it does prove that as Orlando says, it's a complex area, and I think you need to have the right teams in place, etc. as well to understand. So you need sort of in my particular team, we've got multi disciplines across security, but we're managing supply chain. So I think it's understanding the complexity and across all the different regulatory situations and aspects.
So, is
Yeah,
there
just
anything
to add,
special being done for data privacy, right? That's, yeah, good.
yeah, I was just going to add that one thing that's really highlighted is really how technology vendors are being used across the enterprise. And I've seen it for a very long time across the industry, this notion of shadow IT, where businesses would directly go and procure technology, something that kind of looks like a technology service, technology vendor, a data provider, integrated into their environment, would not get actual technology organization engaged. And then what happens is it hasn't been vetted initially. It doesn't go through the appropriate treatment strategy for ongoing monitoring. And then everyone is surprised because all of a sudden, when central technology organization gets involved, often it even goes undiscovered for a long time. They find all the gaps. There is technical debt. There is all of this remediation that now needs to be done, and that type of engagement is going to be very difficult to remediate. So having proactive governance for how all of technology spend is managed across the enterprise, fighting the kind of ungoverned shadow IT and putting controls around it is really an important topic for how do you really manage risk for your technology vendors.
We've got a very good relationship with our procurement area, where I would say probably 95% at least we get to see, and we make sure that their inherent risk ratings are known at the beginning. And as Alex says, you don't end up getting down that sort of dead end where you're stuck with something 3 years down the line and you're trying to discover what it actually is. And dependent on what the inherent risk is, then you can apply your control sets, your oversight frequencies, etc. But I think the relationship with procurement is vital, so you know exactly what's going through, and procurement are then the leader of things, and it makes it more and more difficult for the business to go out and purchase the shadow IT.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, and I completely agree with what has just been said. One thing I also tend to look at is beyond regulation and required legal requirements, is to establish common standards across a footprint and then work by exception to ensure we comply with local regulations. Because what I find is that if we do, which a lot of organizations do, kind of a bottom-up approach, and end up having as many standards almost as we have jurisdictions and sometimes multiple standards in the same country, it makes it almost impossible for us to properly embed data privacy management and confidentiality. So my view is flip that around, define common standards that will be applied and expected across all our internal processes, but as a result also external parties, and then work by exception from there and make sure that if there are any exception identified through the onboarding process, we have a proper kind of risk tolerance defined around what is acceptable and not acceptable to us. And if something falls out of that, that we have the proper governance and mechanism to and transparency on who decides whether that vendor can ultimately be onboarded or not. Because without that, we are also open to, yes, we might do a lot of review and assessment as part of the onboarding process, but then we let everything go through the door anyway, which is not where we need to be.
Yeah, so all great answers. And what are the best practices you're seeing being effective?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting, right? So we are all taught as TPRM professionals that the way to really understand your overall portfolio is come up with a risk policy, understand that kind of defines your overall risk appetite, look across your entire portfolio and determine inherent risk for every vendor, vendor engagement, then determine risk treatment strategy. What are you going to do in terms of ongoing monitoring? What kind of due diligence you're going to do and how often for your high risk? Maybe you go on site every year. Maybe for your medium risk, you just do a remote assessment. And then, I mean, looking at the rest of it, now there is all this like low risk vendors. And of course, the gap is often that we just don't have the resources and the time to do anything. There's so much going on now with so many new approaches being available to help to do that and also now validate that it's actually working and looking really at the vendor portfolio approach. Don't neglect your lower tier vendors as part of all of this because that's where most of your risk is. I think Julian mentioned earlier, right, looking at some of the cybersecurity rating providers. I think that's a great way of supplementing understanding of the whole portfolio program. I think financial health rating providers, cybersecurity rating providers, looking at location risk. There is a lot of cool innovation out there. There's ways of looking at estimating probability of data breaches, looking outside in, using statistical models. I mean, all of that can come together and give you a much more balanced view around your vendor portfolio. There is no replacement of really doing the inherent risk approach, but I think it's important to pressure test it with this other new emerging ways. And then when you're talking to the board, I mean, the board really wants to know who are your critical vendors? What are you doing about it? How do you balance risk and spend? Making sure that there's a very clear issue escalation process and seeing what's bubbling up for issues or very large kind of purchasing decisions, and then looking at combined portfolio. Are you neglecting that long tail of vendors, or do you have a strategy of understanding what's in there and what are you doing about assessing that risk? So I think it has to be both. I think for the board, it has to be a mix of commercials, risk, high risk vendors, which is your top 20, top 100, and then the overall view of your entire portfolio, giving them confidence that you understand what's in there.
Great.
Just
Other
to add to
thoughts?
that, from the perspective of board engagement, I think it's well known that particularly when you're dealing with technology vendors, there is going to be a knowledge gap, given just the sort of the dearth of experience in some of the technical areas. And I think that institutions and to some extent regulators and even vendors have somewhat of a duty to sort of bridge that gap and try and make sure that boards can collectively attain a baseline level of understanding on the relevant risks. That is not to say that every board member needs to become a technology specialist, because that might not be feasible in their lifetimes, but certainly understand the baseline, the baseline risks such that, independent oversight and challenge of executive decision making can be done effectively. With that in mind, and on the point around critical vendors, I think record keeping and mapping are key, and there have been a few regulatory initiatives that have sought to encourage institutions to maintain sort of up-to-date inventories or registers of vendors sorted by criticality and relatively standardized. And that really can show you where your sort of nerve endings are and where your critical points are, and in a way that actually can be pulled and transmitted and communicated to boards in a way that helps them really understand the risks and dependencies. And not only that, but it can also be aggregated on an industry-wide level to map and identify systemic concentrations, which are a big topic of concern as well. So I think record keeping, abstraction, skill building are three kind of particularly important components in the current landscape.
Great.
If I can add perhaps a couple of items to that. The first thing, and we talked a lot about critical vendors. Now, the question I have, because clearly I'm looking at it more from a risk perspective than actually being in cyber or the procurement function. My immediate question is, how is that possible? We end up having so few critical vendors compared to overall portfolio? And why do we end up having so much noise as a result to manage? Which for me creates a real opportunity to try to simplify and kind of remove layers of vendors which have been accumulated for years, sometimes simply because we didn't look at it holistically, and take a more strategic and holistic view around how managing vendors. So it's not about putting all our eggs in the same basket, but there's a happy medium between having one vendor for everything and having 1,000 vendors for the same thing. I think that's for me one of the key points. And the second one is around, yes, we need to look at the tail of vendors. It's also important that when we talk about, and on the board side, when we talk about the board and to the board, simple language, yes, we also talk about the impact. I'm more focused when I report to the board, less about explaining the technical aspect of the risk, more around what it means for the organization. We could spend lots of time in trying to explain cybersecurity to people, but practically, if we tell them tomorrow you won't be able to access your laptop if we don't fix that because of ransomware, that people are going to get. And so focusing really more on the impact on the organization and simplifying the language in that space really helps getting the engagement.
So thank you, panelists, Alex, Julian, Kevin, Orlando. It was a pleasure. Your insights. We are at the top of the hours. So if there are any more questions that will come offline, I will definitely share with the panel. Thanks everyone again, and happy to host this topic on navigating cybersecurity risk in the supply chain. Thank you, gentlemen, and have a great day and rest of the day everywhere else. Bye-bye.